What's happening, folks? Geologist Philip Prince looking out across what is said to be the third oldest river on planet Earth. If you can't see it, that's understandable. Here in the southern Appalachian Mountains, it's hard to see a lot of landforms because there's trees everywhere. Not necessarily a bad thing unless you want to talk about geology, but if you have a cool overlay like this, it will highlight the landscape a little bit better. This river is the French Broad River of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. See it right now in the middle of the screen actually is a thin green line that is sort of reaching into these brown and white areas that show you where the high mountains of the southern Blue Ridge are located. Interestingly, the French Broad River here is flowing that way. It's flowing north and west. For your reference, we'll put Asheville, North Carolina on there. That's, of course, a place that you heard a lot about with the French Broad last year, September 27th, in fact, with the flooding related to Hurricane Helene. If you live anywhere in the Southern Appalachians, you've probably heard of this river because it has garnered sort of a legendary status because of its supposed age, being the third oldest. That puts it behind the New River, which is just north of it in the Appalachians, and the Nile over in North Africa. So, is there any truth to this? Sort of an interesting claim to make, something that might be difficult to prove. And how might you even go about doing that? So we're going to try to talk about that today and explain what we know about this river, as well as what you can't know. Because in a place like the Appalachians, or anywhere in Eastern North America for that matter, talking about landscape change and what rivers do over time is a little bit different than if you were in a place like the Andes or the Himalayas or something like that. Uh, the drainage network of the French Broad, just where the river flows, is really interesting to consider. We'll zoom it out here just a little bit and slowly but surely try to trace the course of the river as it makes its way out of the mountains. Sort of an interesting thing to do, and I think if I trace slowly enough, we'll be able to do this. We're going to start right here, just off the Blue Ridge Parkway. I'm going to come down the North Fork of the French Broad. And man, I'm not going to be able to draw all these curves and meanders here. But once we get closer to Asheville, which the line is passing, things straighten out a little bit past Marshall, a place called Hot Springs out here. And eventually the river leaves the mountains and ends up out here in the Appalachian Valley and Ridge. It meets the Holston River and turns into what we call the Tennessee, a little bit northeast of Knoxville. So, in a sense, the way you see this drawn right now, the river is sort of like, I don't know, it makes like a loop almost around some of the high mountains there. And you can add a tributary or two. We'll draw the Shenandoah River right there coming down to it just as an example. It pulls in water from a pretty large part of the southern Appalachians. If we were to fade away that elevation overlay, now that you know where the river is, it's at least somewhat possible to see what its course looks like with respect to the mountains. But again, just with the forest cover that we have in this part of the country, it's tough to do that, and you really, really need this digital topography to make everything just a little bit clearer. So where does the hype surrounding this river actually come from? The whole idea about its age is the fact that at its northern or sort of northwestern end here with respect to the mountains, the river keeps going, but it leaves the mountain topography out this gorge around Hot Springs, and sort of looks like it cuts through the mountains or it cuts across the mountains. The Appalachians have a very distinctive kind of a grain to them, where ridge systems or the overall Blue Ridge, even if you looked at kind of the bigger picture, they run northeast and southwest, and that grain is defined along the entire mountain range. In fact, if you were to pull way back in Google Earth, you would see that really clearly defined. The river goes basically 90 degrees to that. We'll just draw kind of a lower part of the French Broad here. And because of that relationship, the idea is the river was already there and the mountains kind of grew underneath it, right? So the river does not really respect the grain of the mountains. It's almost the other way around, right? It's like the mountains had trouble growing or remaining, if you want to say that, where the river is already established. So is that true? Is that a reasonable way to think about things? And can you use a way of looking at the landscape like that to actually say something here in the Southern Appalachians? So, interesting question. You can't really do that. It's important to remember that when you say this is an old mountain range, that means that a tremendous amount of erosion has shaped it into what you see today. But the rocks you see on the land surface in the Appalachians right now were very much deeply buried in the earlier stages of the mountain range, and they've only been exposed by progressive and ongoing erosion. So the landscape here is constantly changing. And if you were to think about what the ancient Appalachians looked like, you would need to have a visual in your mind of something like this, with the most important part being that the structure inside the mountains is one of kind of stacking or shingling of different types of rock. And that big stacked up heap of rock that has sort of a wedge shape is what actually supports the big mountains in a huge mountain range like today's Andes or Himalayas. Got the little bulldozer down there that's kind of pushing up that pile of material. That's a reasonable visual for thinking about how this happens, right? So the internal structure of the mountain is very important, but this goes away over time as erosion gradually thins things out. So this is sort of what we'd be looking at today in the Appalachian Mountains, particularly the southern Appalachians, where you have the same geologic structures that were present in the ancient mountains. Just several miles of rock have been eroded off the top, and it's actually caused the deeper parts of the mountains to sort of rise up. It's almost like unloading a ship or something like that. So first and foremost, the landscape we see today is not the landscape that was present in the far ancient past, and in fact, it's a landscape that is always changing. Any event that causes any erosion in the mountains is always changing them just a little bit, and if you total those effects up over long periods of time, you end up with a landscape that is always shifting and is always something a little bit different from what it was if you were to turn back the geologic clock. So where does that leave you in terms of a river that flows across those mountains? If we were to look at our picture again there real quick, you'll notice that grain that I talked about is pretty nicely established here, right? And what you want to think about in terms of that grain again is these various rock types that are down under the surface. Wherever they touch the surface, they're going to sort of control what the landscape looks like, right? So that idea of that grain, again, is one that is going to be absolutely central here, but we got to think about how to actually apply that in terms of long-term landscape evolution, right? So when people talk about this idea of the river cutting across the mountains, usually the visual or the way it gets described would be something like you're gonna see here, right? So we'll draw ourselves out. Very simple block diagram. And this first one here, man, it's gonna be pretty easy here. So here's our river already exists, and all we're gonna do here is actually just kind of lift up half of our diagram a little bit here, right? And we're gonna make ourselves some mountains there, and they're just gonna kind of rise up underneath that pre-existing river, right? So pretty simple model. I'm gonna wipe this one out real fast. Okay, so got our mountains there now. Something like see here. Hey, the river was already there. It was already established, and as that rock pushed upward to make the mountains, well, the river wasn't really worried about it, and it was strong enough to kind of wear those mountains away as as they grew, right? Done. Easy drawing. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Well, not that easy, unfortunately. The way that we've drawn what's under here, it doesn't really work like that. And the images you saw earlier with sort of that general concept of what the Appalachian landscape looks like today, the landscape is tied to rock type. And rock type, in turn, that you see at the surface has everything to do with geologic structures down at depth. So we're gonna have to back up here. We're gonna have to back up quite a bit, in fact, because almost none of this diagram is really going to help us out that much. So we'll start over and totally change what we're looking at. So in this case, we're going to have some of our mountain topography there. Take it off into the distance. Okay, and there, in this case, we're going to need ourselves some of this underground geology here, because that's what this is really going to center around. I'm going to color all this in. Different colors are going to represent different rock types that are present, because rock type ultimately is what's going to, if not solve this mystery and answer this question, at least give you the best evidence available for what's going on and why, right? So we're gonna try to close all those lines up there. I don't know, it's looking pretty good. Get that one straightened out. All right, off to a good start. Cool. Okay. Really important one right there that we just colored in. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. And I want to change this one just a little bit darker here. Very nice. Okay. So let's turn this into a somewhat more representative Appalachian style landscape. Now we're thinking here a little bit in the geologic past. So we're going to have bigger mountains than we've got going on today. But the overall idea is going to be the same, where we do see some impact of these different rock types, gray versus that kind of beige or tan color versus purple, on what the landscape's actually looking like. So keep drawing ourselves some good mountains here. Got that good grain developing where these ridges are sort of running off into the distance, kind of paralleling some of those geologic boundaries, right? And right here in the middle, I need to have myself a special spot. All right, this is going to be a pretty important part. So we're going to draw it just a little bit differently so that it's recognizable. And last but not least, I'm going to need a gorge off there in the distance. Okay, cool. So let's put some rivers on this, and these rivers are going to be flowing along here, and they're really going to be controlled by that grain of the mountains, right? So they're going to have to be like really almost strangely long. They're going to run the length of the mountains, and then all of a sudden they're going to turn and make their way out across the mountains into the lower elevations. They have to do that anyway, but in this particular case, they're not necessarily doing that by the best and most efficient path possible. Okay, so we'll actually give ourselves a little bit of a gorge there so we can have one more. All right, so interesting arrangement here, but really not the best over time. Now, really, really important river here. We use the same color. Tiny little river, but that's the little river that could or can or whatever you want to call it. That's going to end up being a very, very important feature in this landscape because it is starting on that kind of unusual round mountain spot there, right? That unusual round mountain represents a little change in the geology. And what that's going to do is let that little river that could really quickly open up a big gorge across that, again, sort of unusual spot, right? And now, slowly but surely, that little river is going to start eating its way back into the mountains. Depending on how easy it is to erode right there, that's actually going to let the little river come in here and erode into one of these less efficient rivers and actually redirect its water onto this really nice course out of the mountains, right? So our little river that could has really come up in the world there. Now it has a lot more water draining through it, and nature really likes this. I mean, that's an easy path out of the mountains. The river doesn't have to flow as far parallel with the mountains before it makes that turn, and it's got some softer rock to go across anyway. So everybody's happy here, and that's going to allow that erosional process to keep going. And you may be able to imagine what's going to happen next here. It's going to keep eating its way deeper into the mountains there, and it's going to steal even more water from one of those upstream rivers. Okay, so now at this point, got something pretty crazy going on here. That little river that could is now carrying the water from two additional rivers that it has, as we say, captured because it's got this really nice, easy way to get out of the mountains. All right. So now, man, life is good down here. It's going crazy. I'm telling you what, this is the new place to be in the mountains as far as rivers go. What's going to happen next? Hey, there's still another river up there. Well, let's go capture that one too. Okay, so now we have collected all of these rivers and left this old river course over here completely high and dry. It doesn't have any water anymore. And now this really straight shot across the mountains is carrying basically all the rivers, all the water that's draining out of the high topography. It's got tons of power and strength to erode, and that's going to allow it to carve itself out a really big, broad, impressive valley here, right? It has the straightest shot across the mountains, and over time, it might even be able to kind of further improve its efficiency there and further straighten some of these river courses out, just so you have the straightest possible path for the water to get out of the mountains. And it all centers around that one unusual spot I drew at the start of the diagram there where the rocks are just a little bit easier to erode, right? What would that unusual spot look like? Something like this. We can quickly draw it in. The unusual spot would be set up maybe a little bit like what I'm going to draw right now. You would see a little bit less of that tan rock there. Not a lot of the tan rock, but it's really hard stuff. That's really tough to erode away. If down here at depth you had a little bit different geologic structure, maybe the rocks were stacked up a little bit differently, you could end up having very little of that tan rock and a whole lot of the purple rock, which is the sedimentary rock you see out in the Appalachian Valley and Ridge. The purple rock's much easier to erode, and if you have a setup like we see here, a river wouldn't have to do too much work at all to totally get rid of all that hard tan rock there, and it would have a very, very easy path to get out of the mountains, right? In fact, if we did what we did to the diagram just then, over time, I don't know, you might see this you might see a valley over here start to steal the water from our original or something like that, right? So rivers are always changing, and in particular in a place like the Appalachians here, where you have these really complex structures down under the surface, you're always looking at the potential to uncover more erodible rock and make things a whole lot easier for rivers cutting across the landscape, right? So after saying all that, can you see this? Can you actually like observe evidence of this in the landscape? And you absolutely can. You have to take yourself down into the area where the French Broad actually leaves the Blue Ridge Mountains in the area of Hot Springs, North Carolina. Now, a place called Hot Springs in the Southern Appalachians, you know that's going to be kind of a different place to begin with. We really don't have hot springs in this part of the world. Older mountain range, it's just not something that's here. There actually are hot springs in Hot Springs, not just a clever name. And the fact that they're there tells you that there's a little bit of geologic distinction there right off the bat. Now, what does that look like? Zoom in a little bit closer. We'll have to get pretty tight here, and this is going to escalate a little bit because we're actually going to look at a geologic map that's going to show you what kind of rocks the river is flowing across. Okay, so down underneath my colored elevation map, I have a geologic map that's going to show you what kind of rock occurs in particular parts of the landscape. So slowly but surely, we're going to fade our overlay away right there. And the point of interest here, I'm going to put it right in the middle of the screen. There is a zone of very different bedrock right here. And in fact, you can see what looks almost like kind of a circular pattern there, went on all sides of it. You have this very standard kind of grain that you would expect in the Appalachian Mountains, right? Let me color that a different color here because we're going to fade that geology away and just look at the baseline landscape there. All right, so here goes the geology. The river actually cuts right through the middle of that yellow outline, right? So we'll leave that off. We'll bring the elevation map right back on. So through no coincidence at all, the French Broad River is using a geologic anomaly, if you want to call it that, to get out of the mountains. And that's a really important point because that tells you the river's location isn't a coincidence. The river knows exactly where it is, and it's very likely that it has developed on this course because those different rocks there underneath hot springs gave it an easier way to get out of the mountains. Now, if you wanted to see an old river that came before the mountains and just looked at them with total disregard and cut right across them, the river's course would have to be, I don't know, something like this. It would have to be stomping straight across the mountains like that, paying absolutely no attention to what kind of rock you see at the surface. And we don't see that in the French Broad. Like I just said, we see very much the opposite. The French Broad conspicuously has the absolute best possible way to get out of the mountains. Now, is there a river that does just sort of stomp over the mountains in a way that doesn't make any sense? And in fact, there is. It's just south and west of the French Broad. It's called the Pigeon River. Heard about that in other videos on this channel. Among other things, the pigeon likes to tear up Interstate 40. But the Pigeon is actually a river that you could say is really old. And I think you could also make the argument that it's definitely older than the French Broad. Why is that? It sits up higher than the French Broad. I'm going to draw the Pigeon along one of its forks here. It has many of these really big, tall, steep headwater forks. So here comes the Pigeon, goes through this crazy gorge where you got all the problems with Interstate 40. And then actually it ultimately joins the French Broad out there, sort of in the Tennessee Valley. The pigeon pays no attention to geology. It does not have an efficient way to get out of the mountains. In fact, its course is very much mismatched to the geology that you see on the land surface today. We'll see if we have any geology that goes down that far south. Let's find out here. Nope, ain't gonna make it. Well, if I were to show you a geologic map down there, you will see that again, that grain is very strongly defined underneath the pigeon. There's no easy way out of the mountains like you see up there on the French Broad, right? So in that respect, you could say that yes, there are ancient rivers in the Appalachians, or there are rivers that are older than other ones, but the French Broad is not going to be among those. And possibly one of the best indicators of that is what you see in the middle of the screen right now. There's a little tributary called Hominy Creek that goes down to the French Broad River. Hominy Creek is about to eat its way into the Pigeon River and steal the Pigeon River's water, put it in the French Broad, and make the French Broad even bigger and stronger, and then make the Pigeon as a result even smaller and weaker. So if there were a river in this area that you could say it is ancient and just does not make sense, the Pigeon is definitely your answer. So the French Broad's size and grandeur and appearance of sort of dominating the mountains is very much a phenomenon that has developed geologically through progressive erosion. How would you answer this question for sure? Well, you would have to know where the sediments eroded from the mountains by the French Broad ended up. Eventually, they end up in Gulf of Mexico. You can't trace specific sediments back to the French Broad. There's plenty of other rivers that are delivering material in the same way. So without a river delta that's really close by, it's just not possible to absolutely 100% answer the question. But if you look at the geology like we've done here, you can get pretty close to it and simply ask yourself the question, which river makes the most sense, right? If a river makes the most sense, that implies that it has developed over time and is not the result of some kind of pre-existing situation that doesn't really fit in anymore. So you can play this game as well with the new. It's kind of interesting to do up on that river. Um, I think there are details about the new that people have used to say that it is the second oldest and not the third oldest, like the French Broad. And it's interesting. It's a little bit different. The question is a little bit more complex with it for a variety of different reasons. Probably try to do a video about it down the road. But don't be disappointed that the French Broad is not the third oldest river on the planet. I think a way to think of it would be to say that the French Broad is essentially like one of the most efficient rivers that you'll find anywhere, and it's one that you really see nature at work with. Nature likes efficiency. Nature likes making things run as smoothly as possible, and this is absolutely a river that shows that process in action. So kind of cool to think about. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you check out the next one when it comes along.